This week, we are talking about perfectionism, which is such an important topic when we think about overcoming imposter syndrome. Perfectionism is insidious because it masquerades as useful, and we're rewarded for it at various points in our lives. In this episode, my guest, Elise Holtzman, and I explore what it means to be a perfectionist, where it comes from, and what we can do to show up more bravely and more boldly in our lives. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Good morning, Elise. I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation you and I started privately and now bringing it to the listening audience. Before we jump in, I'd love to invite you to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Kim. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about what I think is a really important topic for professionals, especially for women professionals. So I'm Elise Holtzman. I am a former practicing lawyer who became a certified professional coach, and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called The Lawyer's Edge. And what we do there is we do coaching and training exclusively for lawyers and law firms. And it can be on a variety of topics. So we talk to lawyers about business development, how to bring in business to your law firm. So many professionals, whether lawyers or not, were never taught how to do that sort of thing. You were just taught your craft, and then you're expected to know how to bring in clients, do marketing, develop relationships with people. And so we've got these super smart, very, very competent professionals who don't know how to do that. They're afraid to do it. And yet it's really important for their businesses for them to be able to do it. We also do a lot of coaching and training on a variety of leadership topics. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today.
Thank you so much, Elise. And you and I connected through a mutual contact. And I remember when we were talking, you were sharing a little bit about what you do, and I was sharing a little bit about what I do. And what really caught my attention was when you talked about perfectionism. And that is such a strong, I would say, I don't know if this is the right word, but it correlates so strongly with imposter syndrome. Usually you find those two going hand in hand. And as soon as you said that, I thought, oh my gosh, I need to have this conversation with you, because it is something that I think we all recognize when we have it, but we don't necessarily know what to do about it. And we may confuse it with having high standards for ourselves. There's all kinds of layers to this conversation. And so I really want to ask you, what's your relationship to perfectionism?
For me personally, that's a great question. So I guess I would say that for me, it was partly about being the older child, and the first child in my generation. So I'm the oldest cousin on both sides of the family. And I come from people who really wanted their children to do better than they had and to pursue education. It's the cultural background I come from. It's very much about education and making sure that you're working really hard and all of that sort of thing. So as the first child with all of that attention put on me, I think that became a driving factor for me, was making sure that my parents and my grandparents and aunts and uncles knew that I was doing my best, and wanting them to be proud of me and wanting them to think that I was doing a great job. And so it's not that anybody did anything to me intentionally. These are people who absolutely loved me and doted on me and adored me and continue to do so to this very day. And yet, in all of their efforts to help me succeed, I think I was given the idea really through nobody's fault, that everything had to be perfect. It all had to be done a certain way. And, I've had these conversations with my parents, and they said, well, of course we didn't expect perfectionism. We just wanted you to do the best job you could. So I think for many of us, when people say, do the best you can, whatever that is great. Some of us internalize that and interpret it as it's got to be not just your best, but the best.
Yes, that's a great point. And I can relate to what you're saying too about I am the oldest child too, had a lot of internal pressure to do things just right, always wanted to make other people happy. And, when you think about perfectionism and you start to look at some of the beliefs that we're talking about of like, I want to prove that I'm doing a great job and I'm doing my best. It can be confused with, I want to do my best work, right? I want to achieve, I have high standards for myself that I want to achieve. How did it undermine you, if at all? Has it hurt you in any way?
I think that, like many people, one of the things that it does for me is it just creates stress, right? I'm very hard on myself. I've gotten much, much better at that over the years. I've been around the block a few times. And so I think that, and I have daughters in their 20s. And so when I look back at the pressure I used to put on myself in the past, I think it really just created a lot of stress for me. Like, I'm not doing well enough. I'm not working hard enough. What if I did it better? What will people think of me? All of those sorts of things. And, I think that it's important for people to understand where it comes from. Because I think that when we do these things to ourselves, we also start wondering, what is my problem, right? What's wrong with me? Why do I feel this way? Why can't I let anything go? Why am I so hard on myself? And people will probably say things like, oh, so-and-so, you're so hard on yourself. You've got to learn to let it go. It becomes another thing that people are expecting us to do better. Stop being such a perfectionist. So now I have to worry about that too. So I think it's important for people to recognize where perfectionism comes from so that we're not blaming ourselves for that as well. And I think that I want to mention the person that first taught me about this. It was through a book. So there's a book called Brave, Not Perfect by Reshma Saujani. And she also has a TED Talk. And what she talks about is this idea, and I think this will resonate with a lot of people, particularly your women listeners, the idea that women are and men are socialized differently. And we know that's true. Even in today's world, we know that's true. I remember when my son was born, my third child is a boy, which was a huge shock, as if there were 47 choices and I had never heard of a boy before. But after two girls, I had this boy. And I remember my aunt saying, like, we immediately treat them differently. Instead of, sweetie, honey, lovey, all of that stuff that we say to little girls, all of a sudden it's like, hey, buddy, we're at the first minute, right? We're treating them differently. And so what Reshma Saujani said in her book really resonated with me. And that's why I developed programming around these ideas, that girls are socialized to be polite, to help other people, to put others first, to, be quiet and smile and do a good job and get good grades, and essentially to please other people. We're programs to be people pleasers. As Reshma Saujani would say, in short, to be perfect. Whereas boys are socialized from the very beginning to get dirty and take risks and jump off the top of the monkey bars and be brave and shake it off and try new things. And what happens is, I think for women, early on, we are rewarded for doing all of those things. So we do get good grades and we do please teachers and we do please our parents. And everyone says, oh, that Kim, she's such a nice girl and she's such a smart girl. And understandably, we keep jumping through those hoops because we're receiving positive feedback for all of that sort of thing. And early on, it does get us additional rewards, such as awards in high school, getting into the college of your choice, getting the job that you want, getting early promotions, those sorts of things. The challenge becomes, as we start to move ahead and as we start to become more senior, we start to notice that perfectionism is a double-edged sword. because it has gotten us in many ways where we want to go. Doesn't mean it's always been, the greatest thing in the world for us. I mean, we do put a lot of pressure on ourselves trying to get things perfect, but it does bring rewards for a time. The challenge is that leadership requires something different. Leadership, as we become more senior and we become eligible for leadership roles, whether they're official leadership roles with a title or they're unofficial leadership roles, our job description changes. And the things that we prize in leaders in our society include things like a willingness to fail, big picture, big vision thinking, a high tolerance for taking risks, the ability to innovate or drive change. Something now is happening in the organization and they're expecting us to make it happen. Even things like delegating to other people, motivating other people. And the challenge is that you haven't been practicing those things. So when you are pursuing perfectionism, you really can't be that leader because all of that involves taking risk and there's the potential to fail there.
Oh my gosh, so much of what you're saying resonates with me. And I think that really one of the things that I think about a lot is this idea of how can you be creative and a perfectionist at the same time, right? Because to your point, perfectionism means meeting someone else's definition of what success looks like, right? I'm going to do it perfectly for you. I'm going to follow whatever the blueprint is that in my mind exists around this. That makes it really hard to color outside the lines, right? And when you're talking about being innovative, when you're talking about creating change and taking risks, you have to be willing to set aside the notion that there's a right way to do something and really go out into this scary world of creating something new.
I think that's absolutely true. It's fear-based. We don't want to disappoint other people. We internalize it and don't want to disappoint ourselves. I think sometimes it can be hard to find that line between, am I doing this so somebody else will think I'm great, or am I doing this so that I will think I'm great, right? That I'll be upholding my own standards. And I think over time that line becomes blurrier and blurrier because we take on those things. As I said earlier, we internalize them. I also think it's important to remember that different people may be perfectionistic about different things. Mm-hmm. So there are things that I can be perfectionistic about. I care about them deeply. I really want to do a good job. And then there are other things where I just don't care that much. So a perfect example, my joke is, and other people have talked about me this way and even mentioned my own joke, which is that I like to call myself a control enthusiast, not a control freak. And even though I am a control enthusiast, there are certain things I just don't care about. So, for example, we recently went on a vacation with another couple. The other couple happens to be my cousin and his wife, who we're very, very close with, and we don't get to see enough. So we went on vacation with them. And my view was, tell me where to be and what we're doing, and I'll be there. Tell me. And I even called my cousin and my cousin's wife, and I said to her, what am I packing? Just tell me what clothes I need. So it's strange because we're not necessarily perfectionistic about everything. And I think that goes to what we're most motivated by. What are our core drivers and motivators? What are the things that we most care about? And, I do a lot of work with a set of personality tools called Type Coach. And it's all based on Carl Jung's theories of personality. And, for those listeners who are familiar with the Myers-Briggs model, Type Coach uses the same letters. I just happen to really love the Type Coach model. But the idea is that we also have certain temperaments. So there are 4 2-letter combinations, and those describe our core motivators and core drivers. So if you're someone who is very driven to come up with new ideas and think outside the box, and have a huge impact, you might be really perfectionistic about that. Like, I have to have the big idea. I have to come up with something that's really going to change the world. So, for example, one of my daughters is very much that way. She is somebody who thinks big thoughts, and she wants to solve for climate change and all the cybersecurity problems of the world and all of those sorts of things, where somebody like me is more detail oriented. And so I'm very concerned with dotting I's and crossing T's. And God forbid there's a typographical error in something that I put out. I think about it for, a day and a half and that sort of thing. And so I think that if you think about yourself and what your core motivators and drivers are, what's so baked into you that you feel is just a part of who you are, you may start to see that you get perfectionistic about those things because those are the things that are really important to you.
That's a really good point too, because I do think of myself as, in some ways, I try to think of myself as a recovering perfectionist. I know that there's always work to do, but it's interesting that you say that because there are definitely areas of my life where I am not a perfectionist. I am not, overly organized. I'm not incredibly detail oriented. I am a bit of a grammar nerd. And so I take very seriously how I frame my language and things like that, but I do not really get hung up on, if I'm doing a presentation, I'll write the slides and then I just show up and see what happens. I don't practice. I don't really spend a lot of time preparing. It's more of I like to just get out there and start talking. But where I become perfectionistic is really more in the social realm, because that was an area of struggle for me as a child, having moved every couple of years. I always felt like I had all this pressure to fit in. And I wanted people to like me. And so I have struggled with a lot of social anxiety throughout my life because I'm always afraid of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, making people unhappy. And so I get really perfectionistic around conversations that I have or interactions that I have with people that I care about because I don't want to get that wrong. And so it's really interesting for everyone listening to really think about, where are those places in your life where you tend to be more perfectionistic, and what does that tell you about what you value?
And also, I think recognizing what it is that it's getting in the way of.
Mm-hmm.
So asking yourself the question, what is something I want to do, but I have held back from doing it, and why? And that is often around fear. It's usually all around fear, right? And it can be fear of a number of different things. What if I fail? What if I don't know what I'm doing? What if I make an idiot out of myself? What if my mom thinks it was a bad idea? What if somebody gets annoyed with me for trying it or saying it or doing it? And once you recognize that it's getting in your way and how specifically it's getting in your way, then I think you can do something with it. Because the challenge here is, yes, it got us rewards in the beginning. But again, now we're becoming, as you become more senior or older, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the workplace. What is it preventing? What is this perfectionism and this adherence to someone else's rules actually holding you back from? And when you think about that, then you see what you might be missing. And that's not to beat yourself up about it, but just to recognize, that's interesting. If I had it, if I had my way, I would be doing this thing, but I keep making excuses for why I can't do it. Or I keep saying, well, I'll do it next year. Or I keep saying, well, I'm too busy, I can't get to it. And it may be all of those things. And it may be perfectionism that's getting in your way.
It's a really good point. And I think one of the other themes that I often talk about is the all or nothing thinking that we tend to fall into, because I think that for those of us who can identify with some element of perfectionism, there's often this feeling that either I'm going to do it and do it really well, or I'm not going to do it at all, as opposed to recognizing that there's a lot in between. And so if the fear of making a mistake is keeping us from doing something, it's also keeping us from learning and challenging ourselves and growing in new areas.
Well, I'll give you an example. So, as I mentioned, I have two daughters who are in their 20s, and they're both extremely academically inclined. So they did very, very well in high school. They went, interestingly, went to the same university, which is, a top school. Their peers were highly intelligent and motivated. And they're really, really good at school. They're really, really good at doing well in school. And now they're both out in the work world. And, they're doing well. One is out for 4 years, one is out for 1 year, and they're doing very well. But it's interesting to watch the kinds of things that come up for them and the kinds of things that aggravate them, freak them out, get them concerned. There's so many new little lessons to learn that you learn when you start working that you've never learned before. It's an entirely different world. And I have heard them say things that are kind of perfectionistic, and they beat themselves up sometimes about the things that they don't know how to do. Well, how could you possibly know how to do these things if you've never done them before? And so, no, nobody wants to see their kids suffer or be, briefly miserable or whatever it is. But, I was just talking to my mom about this last night. Like, it has to happen. We know this intellectually. We know that we have to fail. We have to try things and not get them right. We have to ask other people for their advice and have people correct our work and have people say, well, here's a better way of doing it. Why don't you give this a shot? And so, fortunately, they're in pretty supportive workplaces where people are willing to teach them and they are able to grow. And that's a lesson that they're continuing to learn. They're starting to learn how to accept the fact that they are going to get things wrong and they aren't going to figure it out all up front. But especially for people who have been so used to excelling early on, that can be very challenging. But there's no way for us to move ahead. There's no way for us to learn without making those mistakes.
You're right. And it's so interesting because you would think in some ways that people who have done really well in school would be that much better positioned to learn something new and a different phase of life. However, it really is a paradigm shift because when you think about how you are set up for success in an academic environment, right? The table is set very differently. They tell you what the curriculum is going to look like. They tell you what you're going to be tested on. What the model of success looks like, and you're just trying to march towards what the teacher has already laid out as what you need to know or do. Whereas in the workplace, a lot of assumptions are made, a lot of rules are unwritten, and you're feeling this sense of being very out of control over your own learning process.
And I think that that's true for most professionals. If you're talking about if your audience is a lot of professional people, a lot of those people did extremely well in school. These are some really bright people that we're talking about and that we're talking to. Mm-hmm. And then they get out into the world and it's like, okay, great. You've learned how to be an engineer. You've learned how to be an architect. You've learned how to be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it may be. Now go do it. Great. I'm going to do it. But all of a sudden I have to manage people. I have to manage, what's the word I'm looking for? Projects. I have to deal with some people who aren't happy, some people who are happy. I mean, there are things that are so baked into the life of a business that we've never had to deal with before. And just speaking with my daughter over the weekend, there are so many things that she's learning to do. She's moving up in terms of management. She's doing less and managing more. And so that's something new for her. People show up very differently. Now you've got to manage this one, or anybody who's a parent knows this, right? You've got different people. You can, your kids are like your in the workplace. The analogy would be your kids or your employees, but all of a sudden you think you're managing one way, and then you've got these people who show up completely differently. So you've got to manage them differently. So there are so many little tiny nuances of our lives, and if we get perfectionistic about it, I think what happens is we beat ourselves up. I think it's exhausting. As I said, I think it's holding us back from being who we really are capable of being and doing the things that we really want to do. And so I do think it's worth being aware of how it came to pass, not blaming people, right? I could blame my parents for my perfection. I mean, God knows it's fun to blame your parents for all sorts of things, but I could blame my parents for my perfectionism. But meanwhile, even though my husband and I decided very early on, like, we're going to raise these strong, independent women, I still socialized them for perfectionism to some extent. As soon as I saw that they were academically inclined, I definitely encouraged them to be the best they could be. Do you think that they really heard be the best you can be or be perfect? And so I'm not immune to it either. I just think it's worth being aware of it, forgiving yourself for it. We're fallible. You're a human being. You're fallible. And so forgiving yourself for being fallible, understanding that it's not you being kooky. These cultural expectations are baked in. And then understanding the difference between what you believe and what's true, right? So we tend to believe, we drink our own Kool-Aid, if you will. We tend to believe the thoughts that we have. And so, there's truth with a capital T, like the earth is a globe. Although there are flat earthers out there. And so with all due respect to them, the earth is a globe. But then there's your truth, like, oh, I'm terrible at this, or, oh, I'm never going to succeed. Well, how is that? Is that your truth or is that global truth? Right. And so I think that that's something that's important to think about. Also, this idea that what it is that perfectionism is really doing for us. And what it is it's keeping us safe. We've talked about this, right? The idea that it's keeping us safe because maybe we'll make fewer mistakes if we're super perfectionistic about things, but it's keeping you small. It's, and I think there's a constant tension there. Do I want to be safe? Of course, nobody wants to suffer. And at the same time, if I'm safe, I'm also keeping myself small and not doing some of the things that I could be doing. So I guess recognizing, even if it's just intellectually at first, right? Because I think it's easy to recognize these things intellectually, but not as easy to actually have them baked into you and how you behave. But when you recognize, to start with, intellectually, that imperfection actually allows you to be you. It allows you to be the best of who you are because it keeps you moving and it keeps you learning and it keeps you growing. So I think that starting with the awareness, I think that's the first step, is understanding how all of this stuff plays out, recognizing it, being open to it, not beating yourself up about it, not beating anybody else up about it, but simply observing it is a good place to start.
I think it's such a great point. I'm glad that you use that term, being small, because I think about that a lot in the context of perfectionism, because I have also a lifelong anxiety disorder. And when I find myself trying to stay safe and protect myself, what that inevitably means is that I curate my world in such a way that I only interact with things that I know I can do really well or that are very predictable, which cuts off all of the interesting, challenging parts of life. And I think the more we do that, the scarier things become. We sort of increase the magnitude of what it might mean to make a mistake because we haven't built the resilience muscles around it. One of the things that I often recommend is put yourself in a position where you have no choice but to make a mistake, because it reminds your brain, oh, this actually isn't as bad as I thought it was. You don't have to do that in the boardroom, right? But to do it in your personal life. Like, one of the things that I often joke about is, I'm really hard on myself when my husband and I take the kids bowling like once or twice a year. I'm like, oh my God, why am I not a perfect bowler? And my husband's like, why would you think you would be? You do this once or twice a year. Why can't you just have fun with it? Right. And I think about that too, of like, what are the things we can introduce into our lives that we know we're not good at for the sake of having fun, challenging ourselves, letting our brains know, you know what? It's okay to get it wrong. It's okay to practice something new.
Well, and it might turn out that you are good at it. I mean, right, because you have no way of knowing, as you say, until you give it a try. I mean, there's my neighbor's son had never tried running before, and I guess they were looking for something for him to do in high school, so they sent him out running. I guess he tried for the track team. He had no idea if he was going to be any good at it, and then it turned out he was amazing at it. And he actually wrote about it in his college essay. Because he had, the kids have all these stickers, the teenagers have these stickers on their laptops. And one of the stickers on his laptop said something like, love yourself like Kanye loves Kanye. And he wrote his essay about this, the idea that, he really didn't know where he fit in. And he really didn't know if he didn't think he was good at anything, but he tried a few different things and running was one of them. And it turned out he was really quite good at it. So, it's a great example. And also, younger people, I think sometimes are much more willing to try things. And so I think sometimes looking and seeing what they're doing will give us a little bit of impetus to do something different.
I agree. I think that's a great idea. Anything else that you would suggest to people who are saying, this is me that you're talking to? How do I get out of this?
Well, I think going back to the example of my neighbor is really about taking action. So I think there are two things around this. One is the awareness that I talked about, right? All of those things that we discussed. And then the second piece is action. You can practice being brave. You can conduct mini experiments. You don't have to be married to anything. You could say, well, I'm going to give this a shot. Like, I'll give you an example. Last summer, we wound up going out on a lake and doing some kayaking and things like that. And we decided to try motorboating, which I know nothing about. I think I've been a passenger in a motorboat a couple of times in my life. But let me tell you something. When you get out on a lake in a boat, there are boats coming from every direction. There are people, they're towing kids on floats. There's wake surfing going on. There's sailboats. I mean, it's a little bit terrifying out there. And so we said, okay, we'll give it a shot. We'll get someone to teach us. And so we're conducting these mini experiments. Like we're going to go out and we're going to try to dock the boat today, because the driving the boat, as I found out, is actually not the problem. It's the docking that's a problem. But, being willing to conduct mini experiments. And then also, I think, challenging those thoughts in your head, right? You don't have to listen to everything that gremlin, that negative voice in your head says to you. She's there to keep you safe, as I said before. She's there because she loves you, and she talks smack to you and tells you, you're not good enough, or you have to this, or, why can't you do that? But you don't have to believe everything she says, right? Again, that's sort of the lowercase t truth. So I think that, being willing to put a toe outside your comfort zone. You don't have to throw yourself, off a bungee, with a bungee cord attached to your ankle off a bridge. I think that, the idea of putting a toe outside of your comfort zone, we all know intellectually that's where the growth is. But again, it's scary. So if you put a toe outside your comfort zone, pick something that you're a little nervous about and give it a try. I think that reward yourself for trying. Right. Especially when you fail. Don't be like, oh, well, there you go. You tried something and obviously you failed. No, this was important, right? This is an important exercise. It's awesome that you tried something and it didn't work out just right, because you survived. You're still here. You are resilient. So another thing that I think is important is to speak up and ask. You can ask for new opportunities. You can ask for help. One of my kids never wanted to ask for help, and she would wait until she got into a really difficult situation and it turned into a crisis. And we kept saying to her, why didn't you ask for help? Well, what would people think of me if I couldn't do this myself? And so she got herself into some pickles. So I think speaking up and being willing to ask other people for help. Maybe there's someone who can mentor you. Maybe there's someone who can come out on the boat with me, and so I don't crash into docks and trees and things like that. And then I think surround yourself with other people who are just willing to talk about these things, and they're just sort of badass people, right? There are some badass women you can surround yourself with if that's what you like to do, and people who are out there trying to be the best version of themselves, even if that means getting it wrong sometimes.
Such great points. And I think about a couple of things as you're talking, is like relating it back to other things that we understand and accept at face value too. Because when you're talking about asking for help, I think it's really important to recognize that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but it's actually a sign of leadership to leverage your resources. And I think of it as, the workplace, your job is a team sport. And it's like assuming that you would need to be the pitcher and the catcher and every other role on a baseball team in order to do your job effectively. And so if you kind of think about your own mindsets in connection to other models that exist, it can be really helpful to reframe. And another one I was thinking about when you talked about the experiments is I think about this a lot too, of act like a scientist in your life. Don't get emotionally attached to the outcome. Be curious. Do those little experiments. What would happen if I try that? Right? My whole world is not going to come crumbling down. People aren't going to hate me or think I'm a loser, right? I'm just going to try. I'm going to pull some levers and see what happens. And I think if we can sort of think differently about ourselves in relationship to our environments, it frees us to try different things in new ways.
Those are great points, especially this idea that we're not individual contributors anymore. As you age, whether it's in a family system or a community system or a work system, we're not just individual contributors anymore. We really are in a position of collaborating with other people. So it may be, just use an example from the legal world. If you're an associate at a law firm, you may be the one doing the initial draft of a brief or a transactional document. When you become more senior, you're the person who's making sure it gets done, but it doesn't mean you're the one doing it. You may be working with a transactional team or a bunch of people on a particular litigation, and you're not necessarily the one sitting there doing the proofreading and writing the document. So none of us really operates in a silo. And you can't ever do anything brave or move ahead if you're worried about what other people will think. And that's actually from Brene Brown. So she says that you can't ever do anything brave if you're worried about what people think. And, another quote that I really like around this topic is, and it's from Reshma Saujani, who wrote Brave, Not Perfect, who I mentioned earlier. She talks about this in the context of women versus men. And she says, being brave like women, right, is about making choices based on what we want and what makes us happy, not what others expect or want from us or for us. And so I think that's the shift that has to happen, is that if I do something, whether I get it right or not, if it makes me happy, then it doesn't necessarily really matter what other people think.
That's right. Exactly. I think that, in general, I'm a big believer in adopting a service-based mindset. I don't encourage people to be ego-driven in every decision that they make or every interaction that they have. But I do think that too often we put other people's needs ahead of our own. And if we're coming from a place of, these are my core values, this is what I believe to be the right thing for the moment, there are going to be people who don't like that, and too bad.
Right. And to be clear, I agree with you that coming from a place of service, excuse me, is extremely important. Going out there and being of service to other people is really important, but not at the expense of one's mental health, not at the expense of one's physical health, not at the expense of doing the things that you want to do. So, for example, you can be in service and hate what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another way to be of service that's going to fill you up and make you jump out of bed every morning excited about what you do. And so I think that every person on the planet deserves to find peace somewhere and to find happiness and motivation and excitement somewhere. And you can do that and serve other people at the same time. It doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a both and.
Yeah, great point. Wow, Elise, I know I could sit here all day and have this conversation with you. Where can people find you? Any final thoughts as we're wrapping up today?
I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. You can just find me at Elise Holtzman on LinkedIn. You can also come visit us on the web at thelawyersedge.com. And I'm always happy to hear from people who are interested in this topic or any other.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for this great conversation.
Thank you.
I no doubt it will be helpful, and wishing you all the best.
Same to you, Kim. Thanks so much.
Much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.